They tried to burn a frontier girl alive, until raiders stormed the streets. The kindling crackled beneath Mercy Callahan's boots like the breaking of small bones. Each snap and hiss sent sparks dancing upward, tiny orange devils eager for bigger fuel. Smoke stung her eyes, but she would not give them the satisfaction of tears. Not when half the town of Bitter Creek stood watching from their porches, hunger bright in their faces like wolves scenting blood on the wind. Not when Samuel Garrett smiled from the front of the crowd, his banker's coat spotless despite the dust that coated everything else in this godforsaken place. The rope bit deep into her wrists, hemp fibers rough as sandpaper against skin already raw from struggling. Her shoulders ached from hours of being bound behind the post, arms twisted at angles that sent fire shooting down her spine. But she kept her chin high, kept her back straight, kept the defiance burning in her green eyes like emeralds catching firelight. "Witch," someone called from the back of the crowd. The word hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, heavy and acrid and full of violence waiting to be born. Sheriff Hayes stepped forward, his boots clicking against the wooden platform they'd built for this occasion. His star caught the afternoon sun, throwing silver light across faces twisted with the peculiar madness that seized decent folks when they smelled burning flesh. The same madness Mercy had seen in her father's stories of the war, when brother turned against brother and called it righteousness. "Mercy Callahan," Hayes intoned, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd convinced himself he was doing God's work. "You stand accused of consorting with the devil and bringing drought upon this town. Of calling down curses upon Christian folk and practicing the dark arts in violation of territorial law." He paused, letting the charges settle like dust over the crowd. "What say you to these accusations?" She lifted her chin higher, feeling the muscles in her neck strain against the position. The kindling beneath her feet shifted with the movement, dry wood scraping against dry wood with a sound like bones rubbing together. "I say you're all cowards," she said, her voice carrying clear across the square. "Hiding behind lies because you can't stomach the truth about what's really killing this town." The crowd shifted like cattle before a storm, boots scraping against packed earth, whispers rising and falling like wind through wheat. Mercy saw Mrs. Patterson clutch her black shawl tighter around her shoulders, saw young Tom Fletcher look away toward the bank where his future employer waited. These people had known her since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, had bought her mother's fresh-baked bread every Sunday after church and paid good money for her father's horseshoes when their mounts threw iron. But grief made folks desperate, and drought made them mean as rattlesnakes in a dry creek bed. Samuel Garrett stepped closer, his polished boots leaving perfect prints in the dust. Close enough that she could smell the pomade in his graying hair, could see the gold tooth that flashed when he smiled. Close enough to count the liver spots on his soft hands, hands that had never known honest work or honest sweat. "The truth, Miss Callahan," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey and twice as poisonous, "is that you refused a good man's honest proposal of marriage. Refused it with words that would make a saloon girl blush and a preacher weep." His smile never wavered, practiced and cold as winter moonlight. "And now, 3 weeks to the day after you cursed my name in public, the wells run dry. The crops wither in fields that should be green with corn and wheat. Curious timing, wouldn't you say?" Heat climbed her neck, but not from the flames licking at the kindling below. She'd told him exactly what he could do with his marriage proposal, and in terms that left no room for misunderstanding or false hope. Samuel Garrett was 43 to her 19, with wandering hands and breath that reeked of whiskey and broken promises. The kind of man who thought his money bought him whatever he wanted, whether it was land, water rights, or young women who should know their place. Curious timing indeed, she agreed, meeting his pale eyes without flinching. "Right after you bought up half the water rights in the county. Right after you dammed the creek upstream from every farm that wouldn't sell to you at fire sale prices." His jaw tightened, the only crack in his carefully maintained composure. Someone in the crowd murmured, "Mrs. Kowalski, maybe, or one of the German farmers from the north section who'd been hardest hit by the drought." But Sheriff Hayes raised his hand for silence, and the square fell quiet as a church on Monday morning. "Enough talk," Hayes declared. The evidence speaks plain as scripture. Martha Kowalski saw you dancing naked under the full moon, calling on dark spirits with words in a tongue no Christian should speak. Pete Morrison found chicken bones arranged in a circle behind your cabin, still bloody from whatever unholy ritual you performed. And 3 days after you cursed Samuel Garrett's name in the middle of Main Street, the rain stopped falling. Mercy almost laughed, the sound bitter as wormwood on her tongue. Martha Kowalski was blind drunk most evenings and seeing devils in her soup, demons in her mirror, witches behind every shadow. Pete Morrison would swear to anything for $1 and a bottle, would claim he'd seen angels dancing with the devil if the price was right. And the rains had been failing for months, ever since Garrett started his systematic campaign to control every drop of water in 3 counties. But none of that mattered now. Fear had them by the throat, and fear made people stupid as stumps and twice as dangerous. The flames licked higher, close enough now to singe the hem of her brown wool dress. The dress her mother had sewn for her 18th birthday, working by candlelight after long days taking in washing to make ends meet. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the October chill, salt stinging her eyes as surely as the smoke that rose from the kindling beneath her feet. She thought of her parents, buried side by side in the cemetery just beyond town. Her father, killed when his horse threw him while he was racing to shoe Samuel Garrett's prize stallion. Her mother, dead of fever 2 winters past, worn down by work and worry and the endless struggle to keep food on the table. What would they say if they could see her now, about to burn for the crime of speaking truth to power? A horse snorted somewhere behind the crowd, the sound sharp and nervous in the smoky air. Mercy's eyes found the saloon steps where a stranger sat watching, his black hat pulled low over features carved from granite and shadow. He'd ridden in 2 days past, dusty as a tumbleweed and quiet as a grave. Something about the way he held himself spoke of hard miles and harder choices, of violence worn easy as a second skin. His hand rested loose on his gun belt, fingers drumming a slow rhythm against worn leather. Not nervous, considering. Like a gambler studying his cards before making a bet that could win everything or lose it all. Their eyes met across the square, and she saw something flicker in his gaze. Recognition, maybe, or something deeper. The look of a man who'd stood where she stood, felt the mob's hunger pressing close like heat from an oven. His eyes were gray as winter sky, and old beyond his years, carrying shadows that spoke of things seen and done that no decent man should have to carry. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and ominous, but Caleb Thorne knew it wasn't weather making that sound. He'd heard those drums before, felt them shake the ground beneath cavalry boots and wagon wheels when he rode with the 2nd Colorado in the war. Raiders moved like summer storms across the plains, sudden and merciless, leaving nothing but ash and broken dreams in their wake. His fingers tightened on the saloon rail, wood worn smooth by countless hands seeking the same kind of temporary refuge he'd found in this forgotten corner of hell. The girl, Mercy, they'd called her, stood straight as a church steeple in the middle of all that hate, defiance carved into every line of her young face. She reminded him of another girl, another fire, another crowd hungry for blood and calling it justice. Sarah McKinnon had burned 3 years past in a town much like this one, up in Colorado territory where the snow never seemed to melt and the wind cut through a man's coat like a knife through paper. Same accusations, same fear dressed up as righteousness, same mob mentality that turned neighbors into executioners and called it God's will. He'd been too late then, arrived to find nothing but ashes and regret, the smell of burned flesh lingering in his nostrils for weeks afterward. The memory sat in his chest like a bullet he couldn't dig out, festering and poisonous, reminding him every day that good intentions and fast horses weren't always enough. Sarah had been 17, accused of witchcraft by a preacher's wife who'd caught her husband looking too long at young curves beneath a summer dress. Politics and jealousy and small-town meanness, all wrapped up in biblical quotations and righteous fury. He'd loved her, or thought he had. 19 years old and full of the kind of certainty that only comes before life beats it out of you with hard fists and harder lessons. He'd ridden out to Colorado to ask for her hand, carrying his grandfather's ring in his saddlebags and dreams of a White House with a picket fence in his heart. Instead, he'd found a town square that looked remarkably like this one, complete with kindling and rope and faces twisted with bloodlust. By the time he fought his way through the crowd, by the time he drew his guns and started shooting, it was already too late. Sarah was gone, and part of him had burned with her in those flames. "Light it, Hayes," Samuel Garrett snarled from his position near the front of the crowd, his banker's composure finally cracking like ice on a spring pond. "Before she hexes us all with her devil's tongue." The crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with the peculiar madness that seized decent folks when they smelled burning flesh. Thorne had seen it in the war, seen it in the territories where law was whatever a man could enforce with gun and rope. Give people permission to be monsters, and they'd take it with both hands and ask for seconds. The girl's eyes found his again across the square, and he saw no pleading there, no tears or begging. Just a fierce intelligence that reminded him why he'd stayed in this dust-bitten town instead of riding on to California like he'd planned. She was fighting with the only weapon she had left, words sharp enough to cut, truth bright enough to blind. Check his books, she'd said earlier, planting doubt like seeds in drought-starved ground. Smart girl, trying to turn the crowd against their puppet master before the flames reached high enough to matter. But Samuel Garrett had money, and money talked louder than truth in places like Bitter Creek. The banker's influence stretched through this county like roots through hard ground, choking out anything that might threaten his control. Water rights, land deeds, debts called in at convenient moments. Thorne had seen the pattern before in a dozen towns from here to the Rio Grande. Always the same story, a big man getting bigger by stepping on the necks of everyone smaller. The thunder grew stronger now, accompanied by something else that made the horses tied along Main Street dance nervously against their hitches. A rhythmic pounding that seemed to rise from the earth itself, like the heartbeat of something vast and angry stirring to life beneath the desert floor. Thorne's hand drifted to his Colt, muscle memory older than conscious thought. That wasn't thunder rolling across the plains like the voice of an angry god. That was hoofbeats, dozens of them, pounding toward town with the relentless rhythm of Judgment Day approaching at a full gallop. Martha Kowalski stumbled forward through the crowd, her gray hair wild beneath a bonnet that had seen better decades. She pointed a gnarled finger at the girl on the platform, her voice cracked with years of whiskey and disappointment. "I seen her dancing with demons," she shrieked, spittle flying from cracked lips. "Dancing naked as the day she was born, calling down curses on godly folk with words that made my blood run cold." The very air around her was thick with evil, thick as molasses and twice as dark. Thorne almost smiled at that. Martha could barely see her own front porch through the whiskey haze that had claimed her since her husband died in the mines. But desperation made folks believe strange things, especially when a smooth talker like Garrett whispered the right words in the right ears at the right price. The brand touched the kindling with a hiss like a snake striking. Small flames licked upward, hungry for bigger fuel, casting dancing shadows across faces that no longer looked entirely human in the flickering light. Mercy's dress was cotton, worn thin from washing and mending, the kind of simple garment that would catch fast when the fire reached high enough to matter. "Stop." The word came out rougher than Thorne intended, carrying the weight of too many miles and too much regret. He stood slowly, spurs ringing against the wooden steps like tiny silver bells tolling for the dead. Every eye in the square turned toward him, the crowd's attention shifting like a flock of carrion birds disturbed at their feeding. Sheriff Hayes paused, the burning brand wavering in his grip like a compass needle seeking true north. "This ain't your concern, stranger," Hayes said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. The kind of doubt that crept in when a man realized he might be about to pick a fight he couldn't win. "Maybe not," Thorne replied, stepping down from the saloon porch with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to violence. His coat fell open as he moved, revealing the matched Colts at his hips, pearl handles worn smooth by years of use. "But I got a powerful dislike for cowards who hide behind crowds when they're fixing to murder innocent folks." Samuel Garrett turned toward him, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. "You calling me a coward, mister?" "If the boot fits, you can lace it up and wear it to church," Thorne said evenly. Takes real courage to burn a girl barely grown. Real courage to steal water rights while folks die of thirst and call it business. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat, some faces showing doubt now where certainty had lived just moments before. Questions were forming behind worried eyes, the kind of questions that could unravel a man's carefully constructed web of lies if given room to grow. But others pressed closer, the blood scent strong in their nostrils, too far gone with mob fever to turn back now. They'd come here to see someone burn, and by God, someone was going to burn before they went home to cold suppers and colder beds. "He's with her," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "With the witch. They're in it together, mark my words." Hayes raised the brand higher, flames dancing in his eyes like demons celebrating a successful temptation. "Stand down, mister. Don't make me add you to the pyre." The thunder crashed overhead like the sound of God's own artillery, drowning out whatever threat Hayes had been about to make. But it wasn't thunder anymore, and everyone in the square knew it deep in their bones. The sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful, carrying with it the promise of violence and change. Thorne smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. It was the kind of smile a wolf might wear when cornering a wounded deer. "Looks like you got bigger problems than one girl and her supposed curses." The riders crested the hill north of town like the four horsemen of the apocalypse, dust boiling up behind them in a brown cloud that blotted out half the sky. Even at distance, their intent was clear as scripture written in blood. Black hats, black masks, guns drawn and gleaming in the afternoon sun. The Maddox gang, or what was left of it after the territorial marshal had scattered them south of the Colorado line. Panic rippled through the crowd like wildfire in dry grass. Mothers grabbed children, men reached for weapons they'd left at home, and the ordered madness of a burning became chaos in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Sheriff Hayes dropped the burning brand, flames scattering across the kindling but not catching hold properly in his haste. His hand moved to his gun, but Thorne was already moving, crossing the square with the deadly grace of a hunting cat. "The girl," Thorne said, reaching for the ropes that bound Mercy's hands to the post. "Cut her loose." "Like hell," Garrett snapped, his voice cracking with strain. "She stays right where she—" The first gunshot rang out as the raiders hit Main Street like a flash flood in a narrow canyon. Windows exploded in showers of glass, people screamed and scattered, horses reared in terror as bullets whined through the air like angry hornets. In the chaos, Thorne's knife found the ropes around Mercy's wrists. They parted like prayers in a hurricane, dropping away to leave red welts where the hemp had bitten deep. She rubbed circulation back into her hands, eyes never leaving his face as the battle raged around them. "Why?" she asked, having to shout over the sound of gunfire and screaming. "Long story," he replied, pressing his spare gun into her hands. The weapon was a Smith Wesson .32, smaller than his Colt's but deadly enough at close range. "You know how to use this?" Her smile was sharp as broken glass, bright as summer lightning. "Better than most men in this town, I'd wager." The Maddox gang swept into the square like a summer storm, all thunder and fury and righteous violence. Their leader sat his horse in the center of the chaos, black coat billowing around his lean frame like the wings of some avenging angel. Above the sound of gunfire and panic, his voice rang out clear as a church bell. "People of Bitter Creek," Ezra Maddox called, his words carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We come seeking justice for crimes against our blood." Sheriff Hayes crouched behind the courthouse steps, his star catching the late sun as bullets chipped stone around his hiding place. "What crimes?" he shouted back. "What are you talking about?" Maddox's laugh held no warmth, cold as January wind across a frozen lake. 3 months passed, you good Christian folk lynched a boy named Johnny Garrett. Strung him up for stealing horses he never touched, all on the word of his own blood kin. The name hit Thorne like a fist to the gut, bringing back memories he tried to bury beneath whiskey and miles of hard riding. Johnny Garrett, 17 years old and foolish as summer rain, all elbows and awkward smiles and dreams of making something of himself in a world that ate dreamers for breakfast. He'd seen the kid around town over the past few weeks, working odd jobs to help support his widowed mother. Hauling water for Mrs. Patterson, mucking stalls at the livery stable, doing whatever honest work he could find for whatever wages folks were willing to pay. A good kid by all accounts, trying to walk the straight and narrow after a wild youth that had taken him as far as the Colorado goldfields. Samuel Garrett's nephew. Blood of his blood, family by all the bonds that were supposed to matter more than money or land or water rights. The boy was guilty, Garrett shouted from behind the bank steps, sweat staining his fine shirt as panic cracked his voice like ice on a spring pond. Judge ruled fair and legal. Had witnesses and everything. Judge ruled on lies, you fed him like slop to hogs, Maddox snarled, his horse dancing sideways as bullets whined past. Your own nephew, and you sold him for 30 pieces of silver and a clear title to his mama's land. The pieces fell together in Thorne's mind like dominoes in a strong wind, each revelation clicking into place with sickening clarity. Johnny Garrett's mother had owned prime grazing land near the creek, land that would be worthless without water rights but pure gold to a man who controlled the flow of every stream in 3 counties. With the boy gone and his mother grief-broken, Samuel Garrett could swoop in like a vulture and buy the property for pennies on the dollar. It was the same pattern he'd used throughout the territory, the same playbook that had made him rich while his neighbors struggled with drought and debt. Create a crisis, eliminate the opposition, then profit from the chaos. Simple as breathing for a man with no conscience and plenty of money to spread around. Mercy's eyes went wide with understanding, green as bottle glass in the flickering light. Sweet Jesus! He killed his own kin for land. Worse than that, Thorne said, watching Samuel Garrett's face go pale as death as the truth spread through the crowd like poison in a well. He used the same tricks on Johnny that he tried to use on you. False witnesses, trumped-up charges, mob justice dressed up as law and order. One of the raiders, a lean man with a scar bisecting his left cheek like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh, called out over the sound of gunfire. We rode with Johnny before he came home to make amends with his family. Good kid, never stole so much as a biscuit that wasn't freely given. Deserved better than a rope around his neck. Sheriff Hayes rose slowly from behind the courthouse steps, his hands visible and empty, palms turned outward in the universal gesture of surrender. If there was wrong done, we can talk about it like civilized men. No need for bloodshed and violence. Time for talking's long past, Maddox replied, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. We come for Samuel Garrett and any man who stood with him when they murdered that boy in cold blood. The square erupted in fresh screams as people scattered like quail before a hawk, seeking shelter behind anything solid enough to stop a bullet. Thorne saw Mrs. Patterson drag her children toward the sanctuary of the church, saw young Tom Fletcher sprint for the illusory safety of the livery stable. This is our chance, Mercy whispered, starting to rise from where they crouched behind the overturned water trough. Thorne caught her arm, feeling the lean muscle beneath sun-browned skin. Hold on. Let them thin each other out first. No sense getting killed in someone else's fight. But Mercy's jaw was set like stone, stubborn as her Irish grandfather and twice as fierce. That bastard killed an innocent boy for money, same as he tried to kill me for refusing his bed. Same lies, same greed, same coward's justice. She shook off his grip with surprising strength. I won't hide behind this trough while others settle my debts. Before Thorne could stop her, she was moving. Not running in panic like the rest of the crowd, but walking steady and deliberate toward the center of the square where Maddox sat his restless horse. Every gun in sight swung toward her, but she kept walking, the borrowed Smith Wesson loose and ready in her grip. Ezra Maddox, she called out, her voice carrying clear over the sound of gunfire and shouting. You want justice for Johnny Garrett? The raider chief turned in his saddle, studying her through the black mask that covered the upper half of his face. He took in the singed dress, the rope burns on her wrists, the defiant set of her shoulders that spoke of a woman who'd looked death in the face and spat in its eye. You're the witch they tried to burn, he said, recognition dawning in his voice. I'm the girl who wouldn't marry a murderer, Mercy replied, her words ringing across the square like hammer blows on an anvil. Samuel Garrett killed your friend Johnny the same way he tried to kill me. False witness, bought testimony, mob rule instead of justice. Maddox's horse danced sideways, sensing its rider's tension like a tuning fork picking up vibrations. You got proof of that claim, girl? Check his books, Mercy said, turning to face the crowd of townspeople who watched from doorways and windows. Check how much he paid Martha Kowalski for her testimony against Johnny. Check what he promised Pete Morrison for finding those planted bones. Check who benefits from Johnny Garrett's death and mine. Samuel Garrett stepped out from behind the bank, his face twisted with fury and desperation. Gone was the smooth composure, the banker's polish that had served him so well over the years. What remained was raw and ugly, the true face of a man who'd built his fortune on other people's graves. She's lying, he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. She's a witch, I tell you. She cursed this town, brought drought and pestilence and, the words died in his throat as Maddox's gun swung toward him, iron gleaming like judgment in the afternoon sun. For a heartbeat, the entire square went silent as a tomb, even the screaming and gunfire fading to a whisper. Samuel Garrett, Maddox said, his voice soft as silk drawn over steel. You got something to say before I send you straight to hell where you belong? Thorne watched it all unfold with the sick fascination of a man witnessing his own memories played out by different actors on a different stage. Another town, another square, another crowd baying for blood and calling it righteousness. But this time the prey had turned predator, and the hunter wore a badge instead of a black hat. The irony wasn't lost on him. Justice was coming to Bitter Creek, but it wore the face of outlaws and rode with men whose names were written on wanted posters from here to Mexico. The law had failed, corrupted by money and influence, so justice had to come from outside the system entirely. Sheriff Hayes broke first, his nerve cracking like an old bone under pressure. His hand dropped toward his gun in a move that was clumsy, desperate, doomed from the moment he started it. Maddox's shot took him center mass, the heavy .44 slug spinning him around like a child's top before he crashed into the courthouse steps. The gunfight that followed was brutal and brief, lasting perhaps 30 seconds but feeling like hours to those caught in its fury. When the smoke finally cleared and the last echoes faded across the desert, 4 men lay dead in the dust of Main Street. Sheriff Hayes stared sightless at the sky, his star dark with blood. Pete Morrison sprawled beside the water trough, his lies finally silenced forever. Martha Kowalski had taken a stray bullet through the church window, her whiskey-soaked visions ended at last. But Samuel Garrett still breathed, though barely. He knelt in the dust where he tried to watch an innocent girl burn, clutching his shattered shoulder while blood seeped between his fingers like water from a cracked dam. The gunsmoke hung over Bitter Creek like a funeral shroud, drifting through the square in lazy spirals that caught the dying light. Ezra Maddox dismounted slowly, his boots ringing against stone as he walked to where Garrett knelt bleeding in the dirt. Please, Garrett gasped, the word torn from his throat like a confession under torture. I got money. Gold hidden away. More than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. Blood money, Maddox replied, his voice carrying no more warmth than winter stone. Bought with a boy's life and a widow's tears. I wouldn't touch it if I was dying of thirst in the desert. Mercy stepped through the settling dust, Thorne's gun still steady in her hand. The borrowed weapon felt heavy as judgment, but her grip never wavered. Around the square, townspeople emerged from their hiding places like rabbits after a thunderstorm, faces pale with shock and something that might have been relief. Don't kill him, she said, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. Maddox turned in surprise, his scarred face showing confusion behind the black mask. Girl, this man would have watched you burn for sport. Would have smiled while you screamed. I know what he is, Mercy replied, her eyes never leaving Garrett's pain-twisted face. Know it better than most. But if you put a bullet in him right here and now, you're no better than he was. Just another man deciding who lives and who dies based on what serves him best. Thorne moved to her side, close enough to smell the smoke in her hair and see the pulse beating fast in her throat. He'd seen too many executions, too much blood spilled in the name of justice that tasted suspiciously like revenge. There was wisdom in her words, hard-won and bitter as medicine. "She's right, Maddox," he said. "There's been enough killing for one day. Enough blood to water these streets for a season." The raider chief studied them both, his weathered face unreadable behind the mask. Behind him, his men waited with the patience of wolves, ready to follow his lead toward mercy or murder as their leader saw fit. "Johnny was my sister's boy," Maddox said finally, his voice heavy with old grief. "Only family she had left after the fever took her husband and her other children. You know what it's like, watching your blood kin swing from a rope while good Christian folk cheer and call it justice." Mercy thought of her parents, buried in ground that Samuel Garrett now owned through foreclosure and legal theft. She knew the weight of loss, the burden of surviving when those you loved had not. But she also knew that adding more corpses to the pile wouldn't bring back the dead or heal the wounds that mattered. "I know what it's like to lose everything to a man's greed," she said. "Know what it feels like to watch evil prosper while good folks suffer. But Johnny Garrett's dead either way. Killing his uncle won't bring him back or give his mother any peace." Tom Fletcher emerged from the bank, his young face grim with knowledge that had aged him years in the space of an afternoon. He carried a leather ledger in his hands, pages fluttering in the evening breeze like the wings of dying birds. "Already found what you're looking for," he called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Been keeping the real books hidden while Garrett cooked the ledgers for the territorial inspector. Everything's here in black and white." The crowd pressed closer as Tom opened the ledger, its pages yellowed with age and heavy with secrets. His voice carried clear in the desert air as he read from entries written in Samuel Garrett's own careful hand. Payment to Martha Kowalski, $50 silver for testimony against Johnny Garrett. Payment to Pete Morrison, $30 and a bottle of Old Crow whiskey for discovering evidence of horse theft. Land purchase from Catherine Garrett, widow, bought for $200 cash, market value estimated at $3,000. The numbers hit the crowd like physical blows. $50 was more than most of them saw in 3 months of honest work. $30 and whiskey would buy a man's soul in a town where hope was scarcer than water. And $3,000 for land bought at $200 was robbery dressed up in legal documents. Murmurs rippled through the townspeople, anger building like pressure in a steam kettle. These were folks who'd lost crops to drought, watched their children go hungry while Garrett's field stayed green with stolen water. They'd trusted him, deposited their meager savings in his bank, borrowed money at rates that kept them forever in debt. And the water rights, Tom continued, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. Bought up systematically over 2 years, always after the owners fell behind on loans that Garrett called in early. Always for pennies on the dollar, always with the threat of foreclosure if they didn't sell. Mrs. Patterson pushed forward through the crowd, her lined face twisted with grief that had found a target at last. "He killed my husband's land," she said, her voice breaking with the weight of years of struggle. "Killed it with drought while his own fields flourished like the Garden of Eden." "String him up," someone called from the back, the bloodlust rising again like smoke from banked coals. "Give him the same justice he gave that boy. Same justice he tried to give the girl," another voice added. But Ezra Maddox fired a shot into the air that stopped the crowd's advance cold. The sound echoed off the buildings like thunder, sharp and final as the crack of doom. "Nobody touches him," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Not until I decide what justice looks like in this particular case." He dismounted slowly, spurs ringing against stone as he walked to where Samuel Garrett knelt in the dust. The banker tried to crawl backward, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt like a wounded animal seeking some impossible refuge. "You got a choice, Samuel Garrett," Maddox said, his words falling like hammer blows on an anvil. "Rope or exile. Stay here and face what you've done, face the justice these people want to give you, or ride out of this territory and never show your face again. Garrett's eyes darted around the square like a trapped rat seeking escape, searching for allies among faces that had turned cold as winter stone. His fine clothes hung torn and bloody, his banker's dignity stripped away like bark from a lightning-struck tree. The man who'd held this town in his fist for years was reduced to a bleeding, whimpering thing in the dust. Exile, he whispered, the word barely audible over the wind that had started to blow from the west, carrying with it the scent of rain. Thought so, Maddox said, holstering his gun with fluid grace. You got 1 hour to gather what you can carry on horseback. Leave everything else, the land, the water rights, the stolen money sitting in your bank vault. Consider it payment for Johnny Garrett's life and interest on the debts you can never repay. As Garrett struggled to his feet and stumbled toward the bank, clutching his wounded arm like a broken wing, Mercy felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction, there was too much pain and loss for that simple emotion. But a sense of balance restored, like scales that had been weighted with lies finally coming level. The sun touched the western horizon, painting Bitter Creek in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the flames she'd almost died in. In an hour, Samuel Garrett would ride out of town with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of his crimes pressing down like a stone around his neck. The townspeople would divide his holdings among those he'd wronged, redistributing the stolen wealth according to some rough approximation of justice. But the cost would linger long after the last hoof beats faded into the desert. Johnny Garrett was still dead, buried in ground that would never give him back. Sheriff Hayes lay still in the dust, his own corruption ended by a bullet that cared nothing for badges or authority. Martha Kowalski and Pete Morrison had paid for their false testimony with blood, their lies silenced forever. And somewhere in Mercy's chest, a piece of innocence had burned away that no rain could ever wash clean. She'd looked into the face of evil and seen how easily it wore the mask of respectability, how corruption could flourish when good people chose to look away rather than ask uncomfortable questions. Thorne moved beside her, close enough that she could smell gunpowder and leather on his coat, could feel the solid warmth of him in the cooling air. You could have let Maddox kill him, he said quietly. Could have watched him die and called it justice. Could have, she agreed, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands as the day's events finally caught up with her. But then I'd be no different than the crowd that tried to burn me. Just another person deciding that murder was acceptable as long as the victim deserved it. The church bell began to toll the hour, its bronze voice echoing across the square where blood and justice had finally met after too many years of lies and corruption. In the distance, thunder rumbled, real thunder this time, carrying the promise of rain that would wash the blood from the streets but never cleanse the memories from the hearts of those who'd lived through this day. What now? Thorne asked, his gray eyes reflecting the dying light like mirrors holding the last of the sun. Mercy looked toward the hills where Samuel Garrett would soon disappear, carrying his shame into the vast emptiness of the territories like a disease that might infect other towns, other lives. She thought of Johnny Garrett's mother, alone now with nothing but grief and the bitter knowledge that her own brother-in-law had orchestrated her son's death. She thought of all the families who'd lost their land, their water, their hopes to one man's greed. Now we learn to live with what we've done, she said, the words tasting like ashes and truth in equal measure. Learn to carry the weight of choices that seemed right at the time but feel heavier with each passing day. The first drops of rain began to fall as Samuel Garrett mounted his horse for the last time, his face gray with pain and the knowledge of his exile. The water struck the dusty ground like tears from a sky that had withheld its mercy for too long, each drop raising a small puff of dust that smelled of endings and beginnings. Was it mercy or weakness that had stayed her hand when she could have watched him die? Justice or just another kind of cruelty that sent him into the wilderness to live with his crimes? The questions would follow her like shadows, but she'd learned something in those flames that no fire could burn away. Sometimes the hardest choice wasn't knowing right from wrong, but knowing when to stop.